Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Zion Lutheran Church. I think everyone present here in the building knows, and maybe some online don't know, but I'm Pastor Michael Tassler, here, the pastor at Zion. And on behalf of our community, our whole community, we welcome you this evening. This is the third and final installment of our speaker series on how to have civil conversations in polarized times. And it was about a year ago that our congregational leadership decided to create this very timely initiative to serve not only our church, but our wider community as well. And I'm so grateful you're here because you're not sitting in front of your televisions right now, getting information that isn't really going to be that important at this point. But no matter what happens as a result of today's voting and elections, the need to carry out public discourse in a civil, respectful way will continue and will be very vital after today, as we all know. So tonight we're delighted to welcome Felicia Maxfield-Barrett. And as Felicia addresses us this evening, she's going to invite conversation during her presentation. I'll let you explain how that works. But we have a microphone we'd like you to use. Doug's going to shepherd it for us this evening. Felicia will guide us on how to have that conversation. Stick around after, and we're going to have some refreshments in the warm spot of the church. The boiler is supposed to be fixed tomorrow, so we're hoping, yeah. Felicia leads Utah Global Diplomacy as the president and CEO with more than 20 years of experience in government and nonprofit management and leadership, and is fiercely dedicated to helping nonprofits make good business decisions using data-driven evidence. Her prior work history includes the Refugee Services Office with the Department of Workforce Services, Utah Refugee Coalition, and Wasatch Community Gardens. She has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a master's in public administration, both from the University of Utah. She has extensive experience in oral history and storytelling and believes that through capturing stories, we can create a sense of self, explore the world, organize and pass knowledge onto others, and create a shared humanity. In her own description, she says she likes to nerd out to nonprofit management, data collection, music, gardening, and outdoor adventuring in Utah. I hope we can have coffee sometime because I like to nerd out on nonprofit management as well, and we can talk about music too. So please join me in welcoming Felicia this evening.
No, okay. Just takes, we have to warm up, right? Thank you, Pastor Mike, so much for inviting me to come and speak tonight. Thank you to everybody for braving the cold and getting away from your televisions and coming out here to listen to me. I also want to say thank you so much to Sarah Flanagan. So Sarah was on the board of directors of Utah Global Diplomacy. We used to be called Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy. And so she was part of the search committee to hire the executive director at the time. So she was once upon a time my boss. So, interesting how things go full circle. So first, a couple of things to mention. First is if you are cold and need to stand up, walk around, warm up, get another cup of coffee, please do so. Please don't sit in the seat and freeze. And then, as I'm talking, we might get through the slides, we might not. I really want this to be an open conversation. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Let's talk while it's going on, while the information is going on. And the point that I want to make tonight is, regardless of the outcome, how do we find the quickest path to peace? And I'm just going to tell you, I'm not one to keep secrets. I actually hate secrets so much. The secret is, it's all of us, right? We are all the quickest path to peace. So with that, just really quickly, mental health check-in. How is everybody doing today? All right, I see all different head shakes going on, right? A lot of uncertainty, a lot of scaredness, I think, a lot of nervousness, for sure. But angst, is that what I heard? Yeah, right? Angst, like anger? Oh, anxiety, yeah. Yeah, and it's going to be okay, is really the point. And you know, I worked in international relations for about 15 years. I've been in this job for 8 years. I've gone through 3 presidents, and every single president, I hear the same thing of like, oh, this is the end. I just know that they're going to shut down our programs. It doesn't happen. It's going to be okay. Can it be better? 100% it can be better. But it's also going to be okay. And then I just want to say, did anybody catch the sunset tonight? The mountains and the snow, they were just so majestic. And so I always like to bring out just a little bit of a beacon of hope and beauty that this world does have, regardless of whatever the outcomes are. All right, so the quickest path to peace. And I will also say that this is a very Pollyanna approach to this conversation. That peace is such a complex issue. I am an optimistic person. I like to think that there is beacons of hope out there, but they're hidden stories. And so, as was explained, I love stories. And I think as we start pulling out stories and start listening to each other's stories, that is where the hope exists. It's so easy to get bogged down and overwhelmed by the big awfulness that is being reported on the news, that is sensationalized. But it's in listening to each other that is where those little pings of hope exist. And so I get that while this is a very simple explanation to the quickest path to peace, I truly believe that there is a quick path to peace. All right, so with that, you can go to the next slide. Let's define peace to begin with. Back in September, we held a religious symposium called Bridging Religious Divides. The theme of it was women's role in bridging religious divides. And one of the speakers said that peace is not just the absence of war, there also has to be social peace. And so the way that I look at it, and you can go to the next slide, is that we have to look at peace through 2 lenses. One lens being peace through strength, the other lens being peace through diplomacy. And peace through strength has existed since the Roman Empire. More modern day examples would be President Nixon, President Reagan, and then most recently, President Trump has brought it back in full force that we should only be able to look at peace as peace through strength. But what I would argue, and I'm not saying that we have to eliminate peace through strength, but what I would argue is that in tandem with this concept, we also need to consider peace through diplomacy. And peace through diplomacy needs to have equal footing when it comes to this broad topic that we're discussing. Examples of peace through strength are the Vietnam War, the US-led invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. But what I want to do as an example is so that we can look at it in the same idea through both of those is talk about the Cold War. So the example of peace through strength for the Cold War is definitely NATO. It's a textbook example of what peace through strength looks like. Back in 1949, many countries got together and said, the way that we're going to combat the rising power of the Soviet Union is that we are going to create this alliance. But what is really interesting about that is Article 5 that says, when you attack one, you attack all, right? So it really is creating this strong military presence, and that is the way that we are going to establish a more peaceful world. Well, peace through diplomacy is actually looking at how do we give area to social justices, to social movements. And there's lots of examples of peace through diplomacy. The Good Friday Agreement with Northern Ireland, the Camp David Accord between Egypt and Israel. But my favorite example of peace through diplomacy is ping pong diplomacy. Has anybody heard of that before? Okay, does anyone know the story of ping pong diplomacy? Okay, I'm gonna share it with you because I think it's such a fun, cool, nerdy story. So back in the 70s, a bunch of young people from California got together and said, we're gonna form a ping pong team. And we're gonna go to Japan and we're gonna do the international competition for table tennis, ping pong. And so while they're there, they weren't very good. I'll just let you know that right now. They weren't very good. They weren't winning any games. They were in Japan, they were competing, and the captain of the US team accidentally got onto the bus of the China team. Now, does anyone know, at that time, this is the 70s, was America friends with China? Yeah, not at all, right? Like there was a little bit of a conversation between Nixon and the People's Republic of China. Maybe we can end the Cold War, but we were nowhere close. Well, the bus ride was very, very short. But during that time, and this is all through a translator, the captain of the US team, and I mean, he was your typical San Francisco hippie, long hair, right? He's wearing the shirt that says, let it be. He starts talking to the captain of the China team, and within a 10-minute ride, they had established a relationship. They get off, there's cameras everywhere. The cameras capture the picture of the American and the Chinese person getting off the bus together. And the Chinese person says, wait, I want to give you a gift, and he gives him this beautiful silk scarf. And the guy from the American team says, well, I don't really have anything to give you, so I'm going to give you my shirt. And he takes off his shirt and he gives them the Let It Be shirt, right? They shake hands. Well, shortly afterwards, China invited the American team to go to China and tour, and it was the first time that America had been invited into China. That then opened up the possibility for Nixon to come in and start having conversations with the government there. And there's lots of room for debate. I personally think that ping pong diplomacy ended the Cold War. Some people say it was Nixon, I don't know. But it was just as simple as somebody getting on the wrong bus and saying, you know what, I'm gonna talk to you. I'm just gonna have a conversation. And then it just so happens that cameras caught it and it ended up in media. And then it started the snowball effect of what happens when people just start talking to one another. All right, go ahead and switch it. Well, the thing about peace through strength is that it has been embedded in our conversations for such a long time that it's become part of our ideology. And we see it all the time. And in fact, you know, I just put the budget numbers between the Department of Defense and Department of State. Department of Defense gives $824 billion every year to do what it is that they need to do. Peace through diplomacy is rarely talked about. And there's lots of different little reasons on why it's not talked about. Part of it is that by law, there can't be any kind of propaganda, and this is up for a lot of debate also. There can't be any kind of propaganda given to American people. So the State Department actually hasn't done too great of a job saying, this is who we are, and this is what we do. But also, they only have a budget of $63 billion, and that also includes any support that is given to USAID. So it's a very small budget, which means that most people in America don't even know about the US State Department. They don't know about what is happening there. And a very fun fact is, so there's the Marine Corps Band. There's about 6,000 members of the Marine Corps Band. Does anybody want to take a guess on how many Foreign Service officers there are in the US Department of State? Just throw it out a number. 300. Oh, way higher. 3,000. Oh, okay, now we're starting to get in the ballpark. Okay, so 6,000 Marine Corps Band members, 8 8,000 Foreign Service officers, right? So close when you compare those numbers. And yet the work that they do, everybody loves the Marine Corps band. I don't want to say they're not important. But Foreign Service officers are the ones going out into the world and talking about U.S. international relations. Quite a big job to have. So the fact is that peace through strength has become part of our conversations, our everyday conversations, whereas peace through diplomacy really has not. And again, what I would argue is we don't have to do away with the concept of peace through strength. That absolutely has a place. However, we need to start putting more focus on peace through diplomacy. All right, next slide. And just really quickly, so peace through strength also was not a partisan issue. So just this year in April, President Biden signed a defense package that would support Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan of the price tag of $95 billion. And I was listening very closely to the news coverage during that time, and it was more of a Democrat-supported bill than it was a Republican one. So even when you look at different party lines, there really is no separation between the support for peace through strength. Okay, next one. All right, and then geopolitical strategy. So peace through strength, what it really focuses on is deterrence. It is, if we can have this strong military presence throughout the world, then there's going to be less wars that we have to fight. Does anybody believe that? All right, I'm so glad, because the evidence behind that is there are 184 global conflicts that are taking place right now. More than any time in history has there been more conflicts at this one point. Plus, there's 100 million internationally displaced people throughout the world. Peace through strength, through the idea of deterrence, is not working these days. But peace through diplomacy is also not a very popular idea, and the reason why is because it is a long game. Oftentimes I'll be talking to my husband about Afghanistan and how we were there for 20 years. Should we have withdrawn from Afghanistan? What were the consequences? What would have been the benefit? And he definitely believes that we should have withdrawn. I am of the belief that 20 years wasn't going to make any kind of difference for the fundamental systemic changes that had to take place, the generational changes that needed to take place in Afghanistan. And it's exactly for that reason. Diplomacy is the long game. It's all about how do we level the playing field regardless of what your background is, what your socioeconomics is, what your education is, what your access to opportunity is. But people, we're a very impatient species, right? We want immediate returns. And we actually see this all the time in nonprofits, right? You give your donation and you want to see your money turn into something great within a year. But a lot of times those kind of changes that are needed to deal with social issues take such an incredibly long time, but we don't want to put the patience behind it. So it's the long game. Can we be patient enough to see what the results are through peace through diplomacy, if you want to switch it? And when I was writing up my notes, I wrote this up, and I liked it so much that I wanted to read it verbatim. And that is, peace is sustained when there is justice for all, meaning that systems and institutions operate fairly and individuals are protected against discrimination, exploitation, and inequality. All right, go ahead to the next one. All right, so what do we mean when we're talking about diplomacy? Because a lot of times, and I get this all the time when I say, oh, we do diplomatic relations in Utah, they're like, ooh, are you an ambassador? No, I am not an ambassador. I am a citizen ambassador, though, And I'll get to what that means in just a minute. But the idea between what an ambassador does and what a citizen diplomat does is fairly common, is very similar. So it's dialogue. Dialogue is the center of diplomacy. It just means that we're going to be willing to sit down and talk to one another and have tough conversations. It's negotiation. Diplomacy is not a zero-sum game. There's definitely wiggle room. We all can win. It's just a matter of what is our bottom line, our non-negotiables, what are we willing to budge on a little bit, where can we meet each other in the middle? It's about collaboration. We all have similar goals, desires. We want to see a better future for our children, our grandchildren. How do we work together to reach those similar goals? And it's about having respect and empathy for each other. How do we step into the other person's shoes and start thinking about what they are going through to get to the place where they're at right now? All right, so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories of what that actually looks like in day-to-day work that we do. First, I'm going to explain who we are as a nonprofit. Has anybody heard about Utah Global Diplomacy? Okay, this is why I'm here, is because we've been around for 60 years. Very few people actually know who we are. But it is my goal today that after we're done, I can get all of your email addresses and you say, sign me up, I want to volunteer. So, Utah Global Diplomacy, been around for 60 years. What we do is we build global connections between the people of Utah and people from around the world, and we do it as simply as one handshake at a time. And we're guided by the principle of citizen diplomacy. And what that means is that, especially in this day and age when we're so globally connected, you can get on any social media app, talk to anybody from another country. You can get on a plane, travel to almost any country and meet somebody there. It just means that we all have that right and that responsibility to shape foreign relations. It's done simply one handshake at a time. Hence why there's a quick path to peace. Go ahead to the next one. Before I tell you about the stories, so what that looks like in everyday work that we do is we contract with the U.S. State Department to host business leaders, government officials, community leaders, teachers, journalists, faith leaders. They come here to Utah on a themed program, and then we look at who in Utah is doing similar work, and we just have them meet together to learn from each other and share ideas and best practices. So an example is on Thursday, I've got a group coming in from the Western Hemisphere, so they're Spanish speaking. They are all nonprofit workers, and they're here to learn about volunteerism. And so we have them going to the Humanitarian Center to look at their volunteer program. We have them meeting with YouServe Utah. We have them meeting with SpyHop and YouthLink because they have such great models of how do you get people from the mainstream to volunteer with your organization, and then how do you manage volunteers. So that's what it looks like. In a year, it's about 450 of these global leaders. It's about 125 different countries. And they end up staying about 2,500 days in our state. So it's quite a bit of people-to-people connections. So, as was mentioned in my bio, one thing that I'm very big on is how do we track the impact of these exchanges? Because when I first started 8 years ago, being an anthropologist and being somebody who likes questions, and if I get a question in my head, I have to research it until I have an answer. One thing that I wasn't able to find the answer to was what happens when these individuals go back to their own countries? Is it that they got to tour the United States, they came to Utah, had a great experience, and now they're home and that's it? Or is there something else that happens afterwards? And what we found through collecting their stories and collecting data is that there is incredible global impact that happens when they return back. So I'm going to give you just a few examples of what that looks like. So Vladislav, he came here last year, and he owns a recycling company in Kazakhstan. And he was here for entrepreneurship and small business management. While he was here, well, just to explain a little bit more of his business. So recycling doesn't exist in Kazakhstan. And so what he did is he created this recycling processing plant, and he goes to businesses and he goes to apartment complexes and he collects the material, takes it back, and then ships it to where it can be properly processed. He was working in the 5th largest city in Kazakhstan. And when he came here, he said, you know, what I really would love to see is my business be able to expand to the 5 largest cities in my country. I have no idea how to even get started. So one of the meetings that he had was with the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity and World Trade Center, Utah, and they talked about strategic planning. Something that, do we have any business owners in here? No? Okay. So when you run a business and you're thinking about how do you grow your business, you know, whether you want to hire more people, you want to expand your operations, you think through a strategic plan of like roadmap, how am I going to get there? And he took all of these tools and these resources, went back to his country, put together a strategic plan, and now he's operating in out of the 5, the last 3 largest cities with plans to expand to all 5 largest cities with the programming that he does. Now, recycling is incredible, right? So this is a really exciting initiative that he's working on. All right, next one. Rush, she came here in March of 2018 with a women's leadership group. She is the youngest elected official in the Philippines, and her whole platform is education. How do we get individuals access to literacy and get them into school? She just wrote me and said, told me what, she and I have actually been writing together for many years, and she was telling me that one of the groups that she's working in the Philippines with is called the Bajo tribe, and they're fishermen, right? So they go and they bring in all of the seafood. The problem is that it's an incredibly impoverished area of the country, and everybody has a job. The children have a job, the wives have a job, the men have a job, and that means that there's no time for education, which means there's a low literacy rate, there's an extreme poverty situation going on. And so what she was focused on is how do we bring literacy to this community? The problem is that if you're spending 8 hours in school learning how to read and write, you're not out there making money. And if you're not making money, the family doesn't eat. And so people were not going to her classes. So when she was here, one of the things that she learned about was public-private partnerships. It was a completely foreign policy or a foreign idea to her on why would the government and businesses and nonprofits work together to solve a problem. So when she went back and she's working to solve this particular problem, she went to the government and said, hey, what can we do to get people food so that we can supplement what it is that they eat so they don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to lose out on daily earnings and be able to purchase food. And the government agreed, and so they were able to supplement the food. And ever since that public-private nonprofit partnership, she has said that attendance in her classes has definitely increased because there's an incentive for people to go now. All right, next one. Ruben, he came here on a labor rights program, met with a couple of our government agencies talking about labor rights and workforce services. He is the Minister of Labor for Armenia, the Deputy Minister of Labor in Armenia. And when he went back, he took back some of the programs that we're doing here in Utah, implemented the programs, and even changed laws and policies based off of what we're doing here in Utah to increase labor rights in his own country. Last one. All right, and then Anastasia. All of us have that story that just like sits on our heart every single day, and she is definitely one of them. And the reason why is because she was here in Utah in February, so she's from Ukraine, in February of 2022. Does anyone know what happened in the world in March of 2022. Right, Russia invaded, right? When she was here, she came up to me after a meeting and she was like, Felicia, I really need to go to a grocery store. And the reason I need to go to a grocery store is because I have been hearing about this American food that I absolutely have to try. And that American food is bagels and cream cheese. And I was like, let's go, right? So we get in my car and I take her there. She gets her cream cheese, she gets her bagels. She's like so excited. I'm like, ooh, you should really try toasting it. That's gonna blow your mind, right? And I'm like, well, let's go look at the gourmet cheese section. Let's swing by there. And so we're going through the gourmet cheese section and she picks up this cheese and she just starts laughing. I'm like, what's so funny? She's like, this is Ukrainian cheese that I'm looking at. This Ukrainian cheese that is in your gourmet cheese section is our cream cheese, right? I was like, of course it is, that's great. And so it was these little things that, like little things like cream cheese that made such an incredible connection, just that laughter, that commonality, the things that we take for granted but other people think is the most amazing thing on the face of the planet, that's where that shared humanity exists. And I remember we had to put her and her group on the airplane to go back to Ukraine the day that the airports were going to shut down. It really came down to the wire of whether or not she was going to get back to her country. And we talked to them and we said, do you want to stay? We can have you talk to some immigration lawyers. Do you need to go back? And the whole group, there were 6 of them, said, we have to go. That's where our family is. That's where our community is. If anybody knows LGBTQ rights in Ukraine, it's not a friendly LGBT community. And so it wasn't only we have to go back to our family and friends and our community, but it's that we've got to continue doing the work that we do for people that are targeted just as people in America are targeted. We have talked since. She is safe, her family's safe, everybody in the delegation is safe. But I think what really hit home at that moment was, you know, we see these big stories. We read all the headlines, we read the stories about Russia invading Ukraine. But what meeting Anastasia did for me is it brought that story so close to home because I had somebody that I knew that was from that country. I had a friend that was from that country, and all of a sudden these gigantic issues become so incredibly small. And as we have friends from other countries, we get concerned about them, and we want to make sure that they're safe, and we want to make sure that everybody else knows what they are dealing with. So all of a sudden, this big world becomes so incredibly small just because we meet people from other countries. You could go to the next one. So how does that have a global impact? Well, as I'm collecting all of these stories, and we've been doing this for, since 2016, so we have quite a robust database of stories that we quantify and we use them as narratives. What we were able to see is that there were some really interesting themes that were coming through that really demonstrated that the exchanges that we do, just simply bringing people to Utah to meet people from Utah and sit down and share ideas and best practices and resources, had this global impact that made communities more peaceful. And what that actually looked like was 81% of our visitors who come here go back and they say that they've built up their capacity. So building up their capacity means they have access to tools, resources, networks, databases, things that will help them grow the work that they're doing. That they collaborate more when they go back to their countries. They get more creative on who are the people in my community that can help me solve problems, whether it's other volunteers, it's other nonprofits, it's government agencies. 76% say that they've improved their relations with the US, right? And so it's not uncommon that we get people telling us, I was terrified to come to America. I just see what is taking place on the news, on movies, on social media, and I was scared to death. But when I come to Utah, all I see are people who are globally curious, who want to know who I am, and who always smile at me, right? We're really well known for our smiles. Sometimes they think it's a little weird. I don't think it's weird. They increase philanthropy. And philanthropy, does anybody know what the word philanthropy means? Okay, I see somebody shaking their head. What does philanthropy mean? That's you.
That's me?
Yeah?
Well, charity is another word for it, but gifts for the good.
So close. You're like right on. So the root word of philanthropy is love of humankind, right? That's all it is to be a philanthropist, is that we love humankind. And we can do that through volunteerism, sharing our connections, philanthropy in terms of making donations. It's just showing other people love of humankind. Philanthropy is such a uniquely American concept, but now they're starting to practice philanthropy in their own countries in a more dedicated way. There's always been philanthropy in every country, right? Somebody passes away, people rally, they bring food, they support the family. It's just more of this structured volunteerism, giving, philanthropy idea. And then democratic laws, 29% go back and implement laws that are based on democratic principles. I would say all of the laws that I've heard so far have been positive laws that expand protection of all people. But what I would say is that one probably scares me the most, because sometimes governments are not ready for democratic laws. And I'll give you an example. There was a group that came in, gosh, I want to say it was like 2017, and it was an LGBT group from several countries on the African continent. And one of the gentlemen, he was from the Democratic Republic of Congo, just loved what we did with the hate crime bill. And he was like, that's an amazing concept. Let's hold people accountable for hate crimes, specifically targeting people of the LGBT community. He went back and he introduced that bill through his legislation. Now, the DR Congo is not necessarily a friendly place to the LGBT community, and so I haven't heard from him, but it made me very nervous, because did that create him as a target for trying to pass legislation that maybe the country wasn't ready to consider at this point? So it does make me incredibly nervous when we do hear about the democratic laws. But a good example is the labor laws in Armenia. Like, labor laws are good. We want to make sure that workers are protected. So we are seeing that there is some movement around the world that just these simple meetings are truly making a difference. All right, go. Okay, so that's all fun and great, but what do we do, right? How do we actually start? And what I would say is that there's really 3 ways that we can start creating a quicker path to peace. And the first one being, it is to practice that diplomacy. So, there was the slide that had the 5 different things of dialogue, negotiation, collaboration, respect, and empathy. What I would say is, when you bring all of those things together, at the core of it, we're just treating each other with dignity, right? We're saying that everybody is worth something. There's a really great resource called the Dignity Index. Has anyone heard of that? Yeah, definitely check that out. I look at their website all the time, because I think they've got some really interesting tools, some quizzes, some ways to get engaged if you're wondering, like, how do I start working through these disagreements that I have with somebody and still maintain that dignity, which is incredible. I'll be the first one to admit, it is really hard to practice dignity some days. But so I would definitely suggest taking a look at that resource. But diplomacy is just, and that's not to say that everybody is deserving of diplomacy. If there's no negotiation, if there's no willingness to collaborate, if there's no willingness to listen with respect and empathy, then there's not going to be diplomacy there. And so you have to be able to find where can you start practicing diplomacy with people from the other side that also are willing to practice diplomacy. If they're not willing to practice it, they're not ready yet. And you shouldn't waste your time just yet. That doesn't mean don't keep trying. Definitely keep trying. Philanthropy. So I nerd out about nonprofits. I love nonprofits. I think they do incredible work in our community for very little support, trying to tackle some of the world's and Utah's most pressing issues. Back in 2021, when COVID was happening, I started hearing the idea of international relations talked on a broader term. And I wanted to know why were people talking about international relations? What exactly did they mean? And as I started dissecting what they meant, what it was economic trade, right? It was foreign trade and international. It was foreign trade and then economic business. And I'm like, well, okay, so that's good. We like that. But there's got to be more to the story than just business. What does international relations look like? And so I decided to look at what about nonprofits here in Utah. And so my organization did this research project where we found out that there's about 250 international nonprofits here in the state. And when I say international, it means that they're a 501c3 based here in Utah, and they could be working with communities around the world, but they could also be working with international topics or communities here in Utah. So like cultural festivals, ESL classes, refugee and immigrants. But the problems or the issues that they're trying to address at that time are so unique that there's not other nonprofits that are addressing it. And so from identifying these nonprofits, what we wanted to look at is what were the benefits and what were the barriers that they were facing here in Utah. And what we found is that, especially during COVID, their funding and volunteer support decreased, but the services that they were providing specifically to address international relations that nobody else was addressing increased. And so how do we level that playing field so that we see that there's value to nonprofits and be able to provide support? So what I always suggest to people is where to start is just pick 3 nonprofits, 3 of your favorite topics. What are you most moved by? And provide some kind of support, whether it's sharing your knowledge, your talents. Everybody's got a talent that they can give, your time through volunteerism, or give them a small gift at the end of the year. Just start somewhere with 3 nonprofits that mean the most to you, and it will make a huge difference when it comes to them being able to do the work, which is it's the groundwork to make the world a better place. And then advocacy. And advocacy could be the traditional contact your elected officials and tell them that you care about a particular topic. You could write letters to opinion pieces for the newspaper or letters to the editor to say, hey, here's a topic that is coming up and it's really meaningful to me. There is, maybe some of you are part of it. There's a nonprofit here. It's an advocacy group that addresses climate change, climate legislation, citizen climate lobby. Yes. Does anyone know about them? Yeah, they do the most incredible advocacy work. They teach you how to write those letters, how to contact your elected officials and say that this is something that is meaningful to me. Absolutely use your voice to do so. But I would also say to take it one step further and look at what books are you reading, what movies are you watching. Post things on social media. If you read an article where you're like, this is such an incredible story that people should know about, post about it on social media so that other people can see that international relations is something that is meaningful to you. And at that point that we start bringing these little stories that we're hearing, these little points of engagement through working with different nonprofits or having conversations or talking to an elected official or watching a movie that talks about, some kind of global issue that moves you, all of a sudden, instead of putting the focus on peace through strength, we're actually putting the focus on peace through diplomacy. And I would say at that point is where citizen diplomacy starts coming into play. And citizen diplomacy, again, is just that simple. Everybody here has the right and the responsibility to shape foreign relations, and we do it one handshake at a time. We do it one song at a time, one lecture at a time. Like, it's all of these little pinpoints where we start amplifying the good that is taking place instead of giving so much attention to these big pictures that seem to be hopeless and so much larger than any one person can even start to comprehend. So, with that, I think that's it. Yes, thank you. So, yeah. You are a very quiet group. So, any questions?
Felicia, I appreciate you talking about the impacts that the programs have had on the international visitors, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact that these programs have on us, the volunteers, because as one of your volunteers, I've always found that when we host visitors, there's a noticeable change in how my family talks about issues in the world, and so I was wondering if you're gathering any data on that or if you have any anecdotes to share.
Yeah, so we've tried to collect data on the local Utah level about that. What we find is that all of our volunteers, and I mean, anecdotally, we know that our programs are impactful because it's the same people who continue to come back and volunteer with us, which, thank you for bringing that up. One of the volunteer opportunities that we have is hosting dinners for people. All you do is you open up your home, you cook a meal, and 3, 4, however many people you can host will come over to your house and have a meal with you. And it's the most unbelievable conversations that take place. So if anyone is interested in hosting dinners, or we also have overnight homestay opportunities, let me know. What we find is that our volunteers say, we love it. It was such an incredible experience. Please contact me again the next time you need a volunteer. And we try to get details out of them. We're like, what made the experience amazing? We don't really get that far. And so what we did is we cooperated in a national survey of the impact here on the American level. So what we do is part of this larger network. There's 86 of us throughout the United States. Almost every major city has an organization like us. We serve the entire state of Utah. What that study found is that a couple of things. One is that it expands global knowledge. So all of a sudden people are able to say, oh, I found out about this country that I never knew existed before. And so all of a sudden there's this expansion of education. It gives us more pride as an American people because we get so excited about talking about our lives and our experiences and what makes our microcosm of how we exist such an incredible, unique experience. And all of a sudden, we're excited to live in America and be part of this larger community that gets to host international visitors. And then it also expands to the family where they start thinking more globally about the work that they do, specifically through the example that I gave of Anastasia, where I'm going to think twice before I say something negative about a country because I have a friend that I met in that country. Just a really quick story is on October 7th last year, we were hosting a group of women leaders from North Africa and the Middle East, and one was Palestinian and the other one was Israeli. And let me tell you how difficult it was to get both of them out of their room because they were so terrified to leave their hotel room, not knowing what was going to exist on the other side or how they were going to interact with each other. We brought in a mediator to have a conversation and say, like, you're here, how do we make you feel safe? But then how do we make you feel safe and comfortable with each other? And it was such a unique conversation that took place. So that's what we're looking at on the local level.
Just two things.
Yeah.
I always want to make a plug for the Council on Foreign Relations, which is
Yes.
a Utah group that Julie and I belong to, and we've been going to it for a number of years now, and they meet every other month, and they bring in a speaker. The last speaker had just written a book published a month or two ago called The Boiling Moat about Taiwan and China. And they meet once a month with dinner, and they bring in great speakers. You know, almost everybody's a diplomat, or they brought I think the last general in charge of U.S. forces in Iraq was there 2 months ago. So it's a great, if you're interested in foreign relations, it's a Utah Council on Foreign Relations. It's a global, well, in the U.S. they have an office in Washington. Yeah. But if anybody's interested, let me know. It's really a fun group to go to. I have a question about global peace.
Okay.
The trade-off of having 184 conflicts right now is that's a natural result of having one global superpower. And if you look at prolonged periods of peace in the world, following Genghis Khan, following the Ottoman Empire, following our defeat of Japan, how do you separate out those peaceful episodes where there was no diplomacy? I mean, Genghis Khan just threw people over the wall, the top 5 leaders, and said, if you don't like that, we'll throw 50 over, or 500. I mean, how do you, I mean, you have to have power to maintain peace, but how do you separate out? I mean, it'd be nice to have more money going to diplomacy, but how do we cut back on the global power?
What I'm going to say is probably a little controversial, and that is, in the last, I would say, 100 years, the global geopolitical conflicts that we're looking at have been a result because the U.S. has been that global power. And it's because we have either directly impacted politics and governance in those countries, or we have done proxy interference with those countries. Almost every refugee crisis in modern history has been because we've interfered. The way that I would answer your question is, you know, again, there has to be peace through strength. There has to be, right? We're human. Sometimes we don't get along, and sometimes we have to assert ourselves. But in tandem with that, you have to have the long game planned out on how do we also work with the communities, create sustainability. Well, I'll just give you an example. In May of 2021, World Trade Center Utah brought in this phenomenal speaker. It was the Minister of Industry from Sudan. Great speaker. He came in and he said, we've got a new government, we have new infrastructure, we have allies on our side, we feel like we are ready to start expanding our business relationships, and that is why I'm here. I'm pitching to you to invest in it, right? So he was very much talking to peace through strength, we're ready to move forward. The problem is what was that, about 4 or 5 months later in September of 2021, there was another coup. And it completely unraveled everything that peace through strength built up, and it was because we hadn't invested into how do you sustain rule of law? How do you create access to education, gender rights, basic human services, access to health care, right? Prevention. Prevention is so underrated, but it really is the foundation of how all these countries grow. And so, I mean, and that's the thing about prevention. How do you measure prevention? How do you measure something that never happened, but you think maybe it would have happened had the right pieces been into place? You know, I truly believe that had the allies that gone in to help Sudan sustain itself also brought in the long game of social services and diplomacy, then maybe it would have sustained itself a little bit longer than it did.
Okay, so there's a lot of discussion here, I'd say is at the international level. But right here within the U.S., within our community, what we have is those items that you put up there regarding diplomacy, beginning with dialogue and ending with empathy. Many of those terms are foreign to a lot of people. It is a total mismatch to their set of values and their belief system. And, you know, there are certain trigger things. The term woke comes up, you know. Here's where woke goes to die, because anything that's empathy, well, obviously that's woke. How do you break through that barrier? You try to have a dialogue, and they say, oh, no, well, that's, you know, they throw a gauntlet down of some trigger word or trigger concept, and that's the end of the discussion.
Yeah, you're right. What I would say is we can never start out the gate with the big ticket items. There are things that we are never going to agree on between one side and the other side. That's not where diplomacy exists. And so you have to be able to find where does that shared humanity actually exist. And it might be as something as simple as a meal, right? It might be, this is my favorite restaurant. It's your favorite restaurant too? Let's go to lunch sometime, right? And I know that sounds so incredibly Pollyanna-ish, but that's where you start chipping away. I mean, you know, there's a reason why the Grand Canyon was formed. Millions of years of water chipping away at rock, carving out the canyon, right? It's diplomacy is the long game. It's not something that's going to have immediate reaction. And you know, what I would say is, so I love bicycling. I think it's fun. And last year I went and did this ride called RAGBRAI. Has anyone heard of it before? All right, yeah. So RAGBRAI is you ride your bike across the state of Iowa, right? 7 days you ride your bike across Iowa. I knew that, and I even had shirts that was like, you know, world peace, one bicycle ride at a time, right? I knew that if I started talking about my organization and what we do and world peace and kumbaya, people were going to be like, okay, go away. Like, this is way too much. We're here to ride bikes. But I have to say, when you're riding with 30,000 other people, and I love riding a bicycle, and you love riding a bicycle, and we're riding together for 100 miles in a day, the conversations that we can start having with each other are so incredibly unique. It's just that little chip at a time. It's that long game. And sometimes it might be hard to figure out where that entry point is to start the conversation. But when you can start building that foundation of friendship and know that there has to be boundaries about specific issues that you're never going to agree on, and that's okay, then that's where you start actually making a headway into it. It's hard to say on a night like that tonight. I'm just going to be honest with you. I agree, this is a tough concept.
I'm going to call time.
Okay.
And
Okay.
we can continue our conversations
Yes.
with some refreshments.
Yeah.
But thanks again, Felicia.
Yeah, thank
Let's,
you.